The morning Alma Greer stepped off the supply wagon in Sallow Creek. The platform was empty, save for a dog sleeping in the shade and a hand-lettered sign that had blown half off its post. Whitfield Ranch, 4 miles. The rest was smudged by rain. She had a single trunk, a carpet bag, and 43 cents, which was what remained of her savings after the train from Winnipeg, and 2 nights in a boarding house where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument in the next room. She did not spend time feeling sorry about any of it. Feeling sorry had never once changed the arithmetic of a situation, and Alma had learned early that arithmetic was the only honest language the world spoke. She found the only livery in town and paid a boy 15 cents to drive her out to the ranch. The land was flatter than she'd expected. She'd grown up in Ontario hill country where you could never see more than a mile in any direction. Here the horizon stretched so far it made her feel exposed in a way she couldn't quite name. Grass gone bronze in the autumn chill, a creek winking silver in the distance, and then the ranch house. A low structure with a new roof and old walls, the kind of place that had been repaired so many times it was hard to tell what the original had been. Cobb Whitfield was in the yard-splitting wood when the wagon pulled up. He was taller than she'd imagined from the letter, taller and broader, and considerably grimmer. The advertisement had said widower with 2 children, good land, fair-minded. It had not said that he would look at her arrival the way a man looks at a bill he knows he can't pay. He set down the axe. He didn't come forward. Miss Greer, he said, not a question. Yes. She climbed down without waiting for help. He studied her for a moment with dark, unreadable eyes, then turned to the boy driving the wagon. Take the trunk to the south room. Then to Alma. House is through there. Kids'll be back from the creek by supper. That was the entirety of her welcome to the Whitfield Ranch. She found the south room herself. It was small and cold, but the cot had a clean quilt folded on it, and someone had put a tin of dried lavender on the windowsill. The lavender was old and half crumbled, but it was there. Alma stood looking at it for a long moment before she set down her carpet bag and began to unpack. The children came in before supper, loud with the particular energy of kids who hadn't spoken to an adult all afternoon and had stored everything up. Rory was 10. All knees and opinions, and he introduced himself by informing Alma that the last woman his father had brought out hadn't lasted 3 weeks. His sister Dora was 7, and stood slightly behind her brother, watching Alma with the solemn assessment of someone twice her age. What happened to her? Alma asked. Rory shrugged. Pa doesn't talk about it. She cried a lot, and the winter scared her. He said it without cruelty, just fact. Are you going to be scared of the winter? I lived in Winnipeg for 2 years, Alma said. Rory considered this, then apparently decided it was adequate credentials. He sat down at the table. Dora followed, and for the first time the little girl almost smiled. Cobb came in from outside just as Alma was setting out the food she'd found in the larder. Cornbread, salt pork, the last of some dried beans she'd stretched into something approximating a stew. He sat at the head of the table and said nothing about the meal. Neither complaint nor thanks, just ate with the efficiency of a man who had stopped thinking of food as anything other than fuel. The advertisement said you had good land, Alma said when the silence had gone on long enough. It's not bad land. The south field looked patchy coming in. He looked at her then, properly. You know something about fields? My father farmed. I kept his books for 6 years. She set down her fork. I also kept the books for a dry goods merchant in Winnipeg until he sold the business. If there's a problem with this ranch's finances, I'd rather know now than later. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite discomfort, but close. Nothing you need to worry about yet. Yet, she repeated inside her head where he couldn't hear it. That night, after the children were in bed, Alma sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and thought about that word. In her experience, men who said yet were carrying something they expected would catch up with them. She had come too far and given up too much to find herself stranded in the middle of the Northwest Territories, because a man's trouble arrived before she'd had time to prepare. She found the ledger the following morning, while Cobb was out checking the fence line. It was sitting in plain view on the shelf above the desk, not hidden, because it hadn't occurred to him that she would open it. She opened it. The numbers were worse than she'd feared. The ranch was carrying a debt of $480 to something called the Dominion Acreage Syndicate, accrued over 3 years of poor harvests and 1 brutal winter that had killed a third of the cattle. The repayment terms were unusual, not interest in the normal sense, but a series of conditions. Alma read them twice, then a third time. By the 3rd year of agreement, the signatory shall provide written endorsement of all syndicate land transactions within the Sallow Creek district, including transfers of title, water access agreements, and grazing rights reassignments said endorsement to be considered equivalent to a sworn deposition in any territorial dispute. She sat very still. She pulled out the folded letter tucked into the back of the ledger. It was from a man named Elgin Stroud, identifying himself as the syndicate's territorial representative. It thanked Whitfield for his continued cooperation and noted that his application for a household allowance, reduced debt in exchange for a married man's improved standing, had been approved. It also contained, almost as an aside, a list of 12 properties in the Sallow Creek district that would require Whitfield's endorsement signature before winter. 12 properties, 12 families. Alma folded the letter carefully and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She said nothing to Cobb at dinner. She watched him instead. The way he helped Dora cut her meat without being asked. The way he listened to Rory's long account of finding an owl's nest near the creek, with patience that looked less like effort and more like genuine interest. He was not an easy man or a warm one, but he wasn't, she thought, a dishonest one, not naturally. She waited until the children were asleep. "I read your ledger," she said. Cobb was at the kitchen table sharpening a knife. He didn't look up. "That's not something I gave you leave to do." "No, but I did it anyway." She sat down across from him. "The endorsement clause in your agreement with the syndicate. Did you read it, or did you just sign it?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. "They told me it was a character letter," he said finally. His voice was flat, but something underneath it was not. "Said a married man's word carried more weight in territorial disputes, I thought." He stopped. "I didn't read it closely enough. The winter had been hard, and Eleanor had been gone less than a year, and He stopped again. Eleanor the wife. Alma hadn't known her name until now. "Those 12 properties," Alma said. "Are they families you know?" "Most of them. If you sign those endorsements, you're vouching that the syndicate's acquisitions were legitimate, whether they were or not." She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying this to accuse you. I'm saying it because I need to know what kind of man you are before I decide what to do next." He looked up. "What does what kind of man I am have to do with what you decide?" "Everything," she said. "If you knew what you were agreeing to, and simply didn't care about the neighbors, I'll take the children into town tomorrow and leave you to it. If you made a desperate mistake and would rather fix it than pretend it didn't happen." She paused. "Then we have work to do." Cobb Whitfield was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up, pushing cold air under the door. "I'm not signing those endorsements," he said. "Good. Now tell me everything you know about Elgin Stroud." What he knew was less than she needed, and more than she'd expected. Stroud had been moving through the district for 2 years, identifying ranches in debt and offering what he called restructuring agreements. He had an office in the territorial capital, and a lawyer who made the contracts look like standard commercial instruments. 4 other families that Cobb knew of had signed similar terms. 2 of them had already been served with breach notices, their endorsements not delivered quickly enough to suit the syndicate's timeline. "They're constructing a paper trail," Alma said. "Endorsements from local families, signed under duress, to make the title transfers look like they had community support. When anyone challenges it later, Stroud can produce 20 signatures from people who can't honestly claim they didn't know. But most of them didn't know. Doesn't matter what they knew, matters what they signed." She tapped the ledger. "This is why it needs to stop before those endorsements are filed with the territorial government. Once they're registered, challenging them costs money most of these families don't have." Rory appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, blinking against the lamp. "Why are you up so late?" "Go back to bed," Cobb said, not unkindly. "Is something wrong?" "Not yet," Alma said. She met the boy's eyes. "We're making sure it stays that way." In the morning, Alma wrote 4 letters. One to a land claims solicitor in Winnipeg, whose name she'd seen years ago in a newspaper, a man known for taking cases against corporate interests. One to the Territorial Land Registry Office, requesting public copies of any title transfers filed in the Sallow Creek district in the past 3 years. One to the wife of a neighboring rancher Rory had mentioned, and one, carefully worded, to the Northwest Mounted Police Detachment at Fort Macleod. Cobb read each letter before she sealed them. He read them the way he did most things, quietly, thoroughly, without commenting until he'd finished. "The Mounties," he said, setting that letter down. "Stroud has connections in the territorial government." "Yes, but the mounted police answer to the Dominion government, not the territorial one." Alma sealed the envelope. "Stroud built his whole scheme on local corruption. He hasn't accounted for anyone going over the local level." 3 families came within the week, word traveling the way it always does in small communities, not through official channels but through the particular network of women who talk at water sources and over fence lines and in church halls. Alma organized them around the kitchen table, made tea that was mostly hot water with a suggestion of leaves, and went through each family's agreement looking for matching clauses. Cobb stood in the doorway most of the time. He wasn't a man who talked in groups, but he was present, fixing the wagon, bringing in wood, visible in a way that told every man who arrived that this was serious business, and he stood behind it. Dora started bringing Alma small things, a smooth river stone, a pressed leaf, a button found near the barn. She didn't say much. She'd been quiet since her mother died. Rory had explained in the careful way children describe grief they haven't fully processed. But she was present, sitting at the edge of every meeting, watching. Stroud arrived on a Tuesday in late October, which told Alma he'd heard something. Men like Stroud didn't make unnecessary journeys. He was polished in the way that men are polished when they've spent a long time practicing looking trustworthy. He asked to speak to Cobb privately. Alma was sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open. She didn't move. Stroud looked at her, then at Cobb. "My wife," Cobb said, which was the first time he'd used that word, and the flatness of his voice made it land like a door being shut. "Lovely," said Stroud in the tone of a man who did not find it lovely at all. "I only need a few minutes of your husband's time, Mrs. Whitfield." "We don't keep secrets between us," Alma said pleasantly. "Whatever you have to say to my husband, you can say here." What Stroud had to say was what she'd expected. The endorsement deadline was approaching, the syndicate expected compliance per the signed agreement, and any breach would result in the immediate calling of the outstanding debt, $480, due within 30 days. "We'll need a copy of the original agreement," Alma said. "The copy filed with the Territorial Land Office, with the registration stamps." Stroud left without signatures. He wasn't gone 20 minutes before Rory came in from outside to report that Stroud's horse was heading toward the Brennan place down the road. "Go warn them," Cobb told him. Rory was on his own horse and out the gate before Cobb had finished the sentence. Cobb watched him go, and Alma saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Something closer to pride than he probably knew how to identify. The Territorial Land Registry took 3 weeks to respond. When it did, the letter was short and bureaucratically careful, the language of a clerk who was being precise, because precision was all the protection they had. It confirmed that 14 title transfers had been registered in the Sallow Creek district over the past 2 years under syndicate authority. It also confirmed, in a sentence Alma read 4 times, that 3 of those transfers bore the names of individuals who had simultaneously filed homestead claims on the same properties, which meant the transfers couldn't legally have occurred without those individuals' signed consent, which meant at least 3 of those signatures were forged. She brought the letter to Cobb. He read it standing at the kitchen table, and the look on his face when he finished was something she hadn't seen in a man before, old and quiet and waiting, like something that had been held back for a long time had finally found the right moment to be felt. "He forged them," Cobb said. "At least 3, probably more. He was using the community endorsements as cover. If local families all vouched for the transfers, it would be harder for anyone to look closely at the transfers themselves." Cobb set the letter down. His hands, she noticed, were very still. The hands of a man holding himself in because the alternative was worse. "I nearly gave him that cover," he said quietly. "You didn't." "Because you read the ledger." Alma didn't answer that immediately. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He had chosen not to sign. That had been his choice, made alone in this kitchen past midnight with the wind under the door. She hadn't made it for him. "You chose not to," she said. "That's what matters." Stroud was gone from the district by the time the mounted police arrived. He had apparently understood, somewhere between Alma's request for registered copies and the solicitor's first inquiry, that the arrangement was unraveling. The Dominion Acreage Syndicate's territorial operations were placed under federal investigation. The forged transfers were flagged for review. The families who had signed endorsement agreements were notified that their signatures had been obtained under terms that potentially constituted fraud and could be challenged in court. It was not a clean victory. It was a bureaucratic one, which is a different kind, slower and quieter and full of paperwork that nobody but Alma found interesting. 2 of the forged title transfers were reversed outright. The others took longer. Some took years. Alma was not naive enough to think that winning on paper was the same as everything being made right. But it was a beginning, and in her experience, Beginnings were worth considerably more than they looked from the outside. The last night before the solicitor arrived in Sallow Creek to take formal statements, Cobb came to the kitchen table where Alma was reviewing documents and set down 2 mugs of tea. Real tea, not the thin pretense of it they'd been stretching all month. She didn't ask where he'd found it. "You could have left," he said. Same words as before, but different underneath them now. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep thinking it." He sat down across from her. "I brought you out here under false terms. I thought I was only making a decision for myself. I didn't think far enough." "No," Alma agreed, "you didn't." He looked up at that, perhaps expecting something softer. But she'd decided long ago that honesty was more respectful than unearned kindness, and if Cobb Whitfield was the man she was beginning to think he was, he'd prefer it that way. "What I want to know," she said, "is whether you've thought far enough now." He held her gaze. "Meaning this is a ranch with debts and 2 children and winters that apparently frighten women from the South. And you're a man who finds it easier to split wood than to speak." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I knew what I was agreeing to when I answered that advertisement. Not the syndicate part, but the rest of it. I'm not asking you to be something you're not." "What are you asking?" Outside, the first snow of the season had begun. Quiet and early, the way it comes in the Northwest without ceremony. Through the window, she could see it settling on the fence posts, on the barn roof, on the ground she'd been slowly learning since autumn. "I'm asking if you want me to stay," she said. "Not because you need someone to keep house, because you want me here." The kitchen was very still. "Yes," Cobb said. The word came out plain and unvarnished the way his words usually did. "I want you to stay." Dora appeared in the hallway the next morning wearing her coat buttoned wrong, holding her boots in both hands, wanting to show Alma the snow. Rory was already outside, having apparently been awake since before light on the grounds that fresh snow required immediate investigation. Cobb was at the stove when Alma came through with Dora. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, the way you do for someone who has become, without anyone quite deciding it, part of the ordinary fabric of a morning. It wasn't a grand thing. It was coffee and snow on the fence posts and a little girl's coat done up wrong, and a man who had made a bad decision and then made a harder right one. In Alma's experience, that was where most of the important stories began. Not with declarations, but with a cup of coffee, a decision to stay, and the slow, careful work of building something worth keeping.